welcome you all to this book talk series event. And as Rosine has indicated, we are presenting today to you, our esteemed audience, a chapter that is titled Toward an Aesthetics of the Epistemologies of the South. So it is a manifesto that has been presented in 22 theses, and this manifesto was written by Professor Boaventura de Sousa Santos, this chapter exists in a collection that we call the Knowledges Born in the Struggle, which is part of the series titled Epistemologies of the South. So here we are this evening with this chapter that was written by Boaventura de Sousa Santos. Where do we start? Now, I think before we go straight into what these theses are all about, I will briefly talk about the author, who is also a co-editor of this series that we call the Epistemologies of the South. So Boaventura de Sousa Santos is Professor Emeritus of Sociology, University of Coimbra in Portugal, and a distinguished legal scholar at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the United States. And he has published extensively on globalization, the sociology of law and the state, epistemology, and social movements. And his co-editor is Maria Paula Meneses, who is a Mozambican scholar and currently principal researcher at the Center for Social Studies at the University of Coimbra in Portugal. And her research interests focus on relations between knowledges, power, and societies. So we have these two academics as the editors of this series that we call the Epistemologies of the South. Now, this chapter that we are talking about here, Toward an Aesthetics of the Epistemologies of the South, exists in the collection that we call the Knowledges Born in the Struggle. And this collection that we call Knowledges Born in the Struggle has been developed by authors who are academics from different domains, such as anthropology, alternative history, philosophy, ethnic studies, colonial studies, and decolonial studies, sociology, and law. So we have a collection of academic articles that exist in the pluriverse. So we are happy to have this because we have like a holistic analysis of the of the forces of domination that affect us in the global South. Now, we now go straight to the chapter, which is chapter 7, Toward an Aesthetics of the Epistemologies of the South, that was written by Santos. Now, in this collection, probably before we go into the thesis that he has in his collection, or in the chapter, the authors, about 12 of them, talk about a world that is seemingly deprived of alternatives. So they point out that we have a world that is seemingly deprived of alternatives. But again, they say that these alternatives can be found amongst ourselves. Now, as people of the countries and territories of the Greater South, we don't need these alternatives. That's their proposition. But rather, we need to have an alternative way of thinking about the alternatives. Now, these alternatives that we have in the Greater South, for example, are always discredited by the hegemonic epistemologies of the global North. And that is, they deliberately invisibilize our ways of knowing. They deliberately invisibilize our knowledges. And in so doing, they bring to prominence their ways of knowing, their Eurocentric views about knowledge. And as such, we need this alternative way of thinking about the alternatives for us to conquer the three forces of domination that are the central themes of this collection. And these are capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. And Santos and other authors identify these three forms of domination as central to our struggle for liberation from oppression as peoples and citizens of the countries and territories of the Greater South. And in this collection that we call Knowledge is Born in the Struggle, the authors also talk about the fact that the global North continues to reproduce its economic, political, and ontological domination over the global South, even if these forces of domination are showing signs of exhaustion. Now, as people of the Greater South, it is up to us to see these gaps, to see these weaknesses, and exploit them so that we should resist against any forms of hegemonic domination of our people. Now, in this collection, and this is the last point, the authors also understand that some of the voices in the global North think that the global South is facing a heightened crisis of social emancipation and that there's no alternative to the current state of affairs. So they think we're designed to fade. But it's up to us as the people and citizens of the Greater South to find a way out of this quagmire. Now, why did these people come up with this collection that we call the Knowledge is Born in the Struggle, which is in which chapter 7 that Santos authored is contained? Now, this collection, Knowledge is Born in the Struggle, seeks to contribute to the universalization of an epistemological alternative based on the epistemologies of the South. That's one of the, I would say, the aims that this book seeks to put forward. And apart from that, this collection also aims to advance the proposition that there's no global justice without global cognitive justice. So these are the main two aims that the contributing authors, which are 12 of them, have put forward as the rationale behind this collection that we call the Epistemologies, as we call the Knowledge is Born in the Struggle. Now, before we look at the thesis that Santos has presented, which are 22 in number, there are a few, I would say, themes. Should I say themes? Yes, that are recurrent in his 22 theses. So he talks about issues that are epistemological in nature, and he also talks about issues that are ontological in nature, and issues that are aesthetical in nature. Now, epistemology simply refers to, he talks about the ways of knowing for us in the Greater South has been different from the way our counterparts in the global North approach the nature, the economics, and other issues about knowledge. Now, he also talks about issues that are related to ontology, or that are ontological in nature. So we're talking about the question of being and non-being. And throughout the thesis, he talks about other people subjecting the peoples of the countries and territories of the Greater South as subhumans. So they're subjected into this nature of non-being. So he also talks about that. And he also talks about issues of, he also talks about appreciating beauty from an artistic point of view. So we have these themes throughout the 22 theses. So we now go through the thesis that Santos has put forward. And these theses are those propositions that, if taken seriously, would help us in the Greater South move out of oppression. Now, in this thesis, Santos points out that the world in which we live is dominated by three forms of domination that have been with us throughout the modern era. And he says these are capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy, three forms of domination that he identifies. And he argues that these are so intimately interconnected that none of them operates in isolation. However, the special forces or the social forces of resistance against these three forms of domination do not work in coordinated totality. They are always fragmented. And because of that, you'd find that those struggles that are against capitalism would continue to be colonialist and would also continue to be patriarchal. The same thing with those struggles that are colonialist would continue to show signs of being capitalist or patriarchal. So the idea is that we, as the citizens of the countries and territories of the Greater South, need to work in coordinated totality to fight against these three struggles that he identifies as affecting the humanity of the peoples of the Greater South. In thesis number 2, Santos argues that this pattern of domination that is a result of these three forms of domination, rather than being a mere economic or political model, is a Eurocentric civilizational paradigm. I will repeat that one. This pattern of domination, rather than being a mere economic or political model, is a Eurocentric civilizational paradigm. What does he mean? So he argues that this Eurocentric civilizational paradigm is served by an immense body of hegemonic knowledges, which we call the epistemologies of the North. And these epistemologies are based on the negation of the inhabitants and knowledges of the countries and territories that are subjected to colonization and exploitation, which we call the Greater South. He calls them the Global South. Now, these epistemologies of the North are the knowledge structures this civilizational paradigm has developed to legitimize itself, and in so doing, discredit or invisibilize the ways of knowing that originate from the global or the Greater South. Now, so as brutal forms of exploitation emerge or re-emerge, he contends, and reach levels that are unprecedented, it becomes all too evident that we need alternatives and the attendant alternative way of thinking about the alternatives to challenge the status quo. So he mobilizes all the citizens of the Greater South to think about, these alternatives seriously as a way of enhancing or moving towards social emancipation. In other words, it is our responsibility as individuals and citizens of the Greater South to mobilize our resources towards that cause. Now, so in the third thesis, he argues that we don't need alternatives. Rather, we need an alternative way of thinking about the alternatives. I think I also mentioned that in the introduction. So our struggles as peoples from the countries and territories of the Greater South are either not known or deliberately discredited or invisibilized by the hegemonic epistemologies of the North. and the political interests they serve. So again, the responsibility is on us as the people of the Greater South to make sure that we develop our own epistemologies that can bring us to full humanity. We don't have to be subhumans because we have all the alternatives and we have all the resources that we may use to, or that we can use to move out of that and achieve full humanity. Now, in thesis number 4, am I too fast? Okay, fine, thank you. So in the 4th thesis, I think there's a mistake there. I'll just read it. So Santos, in the 4th thesis, says that the epistemologies of the South occupy the hegemonic epistemologies of the North to generate knowledge. I'll repeat that one. The epistemologies of the South occupy the hegemonic epistemologies of the North to generate knowledge. Now, under that, Santos observes that the epistemologies of the South are multilocal, and there are multilocal procedures to identify and validate knowledges born in the struggle against the 3 forms of domination that I highlighted in the first thesis. And these are capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. So he also argues or points out that in the struggle against oppression, for example, such or each culture that exists in the Greater South emerges as an important vector of resistance and knowledge production. So we have the diversity of cultures in the Greater South, and that is a strength. That is a strength on its own. And if fully exploited, it would help us to stage resistance from the hegemonic epistemologies of the global North. So he also goes on to say, under the same thesis, that the epistemologies of the South thus aim at valorizing such knowledges. And these are the knowledges born in the struggle, and thereby rearming and strengthening the resistance against oppression, against discrimination, and domination. So my takeaway from this thesis is that as the people of the Greater South, we need to valorize the knowledges that are born in the struggle, in our struggle here in the Greater South. And it is these knowledges that would help us effectively resist against oppression, against discrimination, and against domination. And in the 5th thesis, Santos points out that there is no global justice without global cognitive justice. So within that thesis, Santos points out that the epistemologies of the South do not question, in principle, the validity of modern science, but they refuse the claim, or its claim, as the only valid knowledge, as well as the arbitrary split between the science and the arts. So, well, personally, I find that very interesting because we have the diversity of knowledge, and we cannot only depend on the northern epistemologies as the only valid knowledge that can help us move out of poverty, for example. So in that regard, Santos observes that social struggle in general relies on the multiplicity of knowledges. So we have knowledges that are born in the struggle in the Greater South. We have those knowledges that are coming from the global North. Combined, I think we can have this multiplicity that can, help us, move out of poverty, for example, and solve other problems that affect us in the Greater South. And I find that very much linked to what we do at the OSC. But we will look at that later on, I think, in the conclusion. Now, in thesis number 6, Santos argues that subhumanity, or points out that subhumanity is constitutive of the modern conception of humanity. Now, under that thesis, he draws a distinction between two states of being. So there's the state of being and the state of non-being, according to Santos. And he says that all this is because of the prevalence of colonialism to a large extent. So the advent of colonialism has led us to having, other people being regarded as subhumans, while other people being regarded as humans. As we go in the thesis, he talks about the abyssal line. It's a line that divides humanity into two. It divides humanity into that state of being and into that state of non-being. So because of colonization, most people in the Greater South have been relegated to that state of non-being. So they're regarded as subhumans. And it's one of the things that Santos points out in his thesis that has to be worked on if we are to move out of this state of oppression and constant domination. Under the very same thesis, you can go back a little bit, yeah. Under the same thesis, Santos observes that, and I think he's very right, that colonialism did not end with the independence of European colonies. It did not end with the colonizers moving out of our lands in Africa, in Latin America, and Asia. And he points out that we, in the current state of the Greater South, are still colonized mentally and other aspects. So we have these hegemonic epistemologies of the North, for example, that continue subjecting the people of the Greater South to colonization. Now, under the same thesis, Santos points out that capitalism is premised on the equality of human beings. But both colonization or colonialism and patriarchy are based on the ontological degradation of certain groups of human beings. So if you're colonized, it means that ontologically you are degraded. I think it could be both ontologically and politically. Yeah, so these people, because of the effects of colonization and patriarchy, are considered subhumans, inferior, and treated, as Fanon observes, primitive. So, as I indicated earlier, Santos also points out that modern domination operates based on the abyssal line. And this abyssal line separates humanity from subhumanity and converts them into mutually incommensurable realities. And this is simply because we have allowed the epistemologies of the North to take root and provide the ontological and epistemological foundation for this separation. So again, we have that responsibility as the people and citizens of the Greater South to change the status quo and promote the Southern epistemologies that should focus on what we, the people of the South or the Greater South, need to do for us to end all oppressive practices. So we move to the seventh one. So he quickly says that modern forms of life are divided into two parts, and he talks about metropolitan sociability and colonial sociability. And he says that these two forms of life are kept apart by the abyssal line. Now, metropolitan sociability, according to Santos, is that form of domination where you have that where you have an interaction between two human beings that are equal. In colonial sociability, we're talking about that form of interaction between two or more unequal beings. So we have the colonial master and the colonized, for example, under colonial sociability. Now, based on these two, Santos points out that metropolitan sociability is or refers or is synonymous with the zone of being. And colonial sociability is the zone of non-being. Now, where are we as the people and citizens of the Greater South? Are we subjected to metropolitan sociability or colonial sociability? So the knowledge is produced by the peoples that are subjected to colonial sociability are either suppressed or invisibilized, made irrelevant and non-existent. I guess that is why we have the OSC working on democratizing access to knowledge and knowledge production. Am I right? Am I saying it correctly? Yeah, so this invisibilization of the knowledges that are subjected to colonial sociability is what Santos calls the epistemicide, which is simply the marginalization or massive exclusion caused by the northern epistemologies. Time. Okay. Now, throughout this thesis, especially in thesis number 9, Santos points out that there are two main aesthetics paradigms, and he comes up with another one, which is the aesthetics of the North, and he says we have the aesthetics of the North and we have the aesthetics of the South. And according to Santos, the aesthetics of the North are abyssal aesthetics, as they ignore the existence of the abyssal line separating zones of being and zones of non-being. We talked about metropolitan sociability and colonial sociability. So according to Santos, these accept all the conventional artistic dogmas such as universality, spatiality, temporality, and creativity at face value. On the contrary, the aesthetics of the South, which we must be concerned with, take the abyssal line as the founding vector of their creativity. So they look at the abyssal line, which is the line of separation, as the starting point as we move towards full liberation and ensuring that we achieve full humanity. Now, in thesis number 10, Santos, which is that's for epistemologies of the South, the key dichotomy is between the abyssal and post-abyssal artists, and rather than between metropolitan and colonial artists. So he talks about the abyssal artist and the post-abyssal artist, and he talks about metropolitan artist and the colonial artist. Now, so in that regard, he points out that those artists that embrace the aesthetics of the North are the abyssal artists, and those that embrace the aesthetics of the South are the post-abyssal artists. We had the second edition of the Festival of the Greater South, and we had a lot of artists that came here. So it's up to us to properly categorize them as post-abyssal artists or the abyssal artists. So who are these post-abyssal artists? And that is my focus. So he argues that these post-abyssal artists denounce the existence of the abyssal line and seek to overcome it through art. However, they are much aware that the art objects from the global South have been stolen in some cases amid the violence of colonialism and deposited in the art museum of the global North. this reflects the hegemonic domination of the aesthetics of the global north. That's according to Santos. And throughout thesis 11, now we said that the post-abyssal artist is a believer of the aesthetics of the South. Now he says that because of that, the post-abyssal artist is an especially prominent practitioner of the epistemologies of the South, which is very correct if we look at what he has covered previously. And he also talks about this post-abyssal artist living in constant confrontation. That's in thesis 12, living in constant confrontation with the canon and its gatekeepers. Now, what is this canon? And where does it come from? Now, so he points out that since artistic canon from the global north dominates the artistic world, the post-abyssal artist has to work against this domination. He has to find a way of resisting the canon and its gatekeepers. It is this canon that is always confronting the post-abyssal artist with the hostile posture, according to Santos. Therefore, the insurgent curators from the aesthetic and epistemological South are crucial for the recognition of the post-abyssal artist. And he also points out in the other thesis that the post-abyssal artist is an absent artist before becoming an artist of the absences. So he argues that this post-abyssal artist focuses on the artistic forms and practices that are denigrated by the global north. And these aesthetics and epistemologies of the north regard these aesthetics of the south as monstrous, blasphemous, primitive, non-existent, etc. But are these aesthetics of the south primitive? Are they non-existent? Are they? So again, the aesthetics of the South, according to Santos, revolve around the lived experiences of those people that have been subjected to colonial sociability, those people that have been oppressed because of colonization and other forms of domination. So again, in thesis number 14, Santos points out that the post-abyssal artist is an emergent artist. So he is a not yet artist before becoming the artist of the not yet. So in that regard, this artist has to struggle for recognition because he has to fight the hegemonic northern epistemologies, for example. This artist, however, has got the potential, the required latency to make it big. Now, this makes the post-abyssal artist a consummate practitioner of the sociology of emergences. And again, in the other thesis, which is thesis 15, Santos points out that this thesis, this post-abyssal artist is an expert in tracing the abyssal line, thereby interrupting the present. Now, what is this present? It's the present where we see some people being regarded as subhumans and others being regarded as full humans. So this post-abyssal artist is an expert in tracing the abyssal line and interrupting the status quo, and with a special reference to the status of the people of the Greater South, for example, being continuously subjected to these three forms of domination that Santos highlighted in thesis number 1. So he argues that through the promotion of the aesthetics of the South and through the artistic expressions, the post-abyssal artists would confront the hegemonic aesthetics of the North and interrupt the oppressive present. So using art for purposes of liberation, using art for purposes of ending oppression, discrimination, among others. So we go through, and then especially in thesis number 17, Santos points out that this post-abyssal artist is an artist whose art is created with, rather than about or upon. Now, what does he mean? So he means that this post-abyssal artist, who specializes in the sociology of absences and emergences, creates his or her own art collaboratively with other artists, including those individuals who do not aspire to become artists. So it's talking about collaboration among those artists that are post-abyssal. And he also, in thesis 18 especially, he also talks about the post-abyssal artist as being a cantilever. As we said earlier on, this post-abyssal artist specializes in the art of tracing the abyssal line. And in so doing, this artist disrupts the status quo. So it's like a beam that lights in darkness. He's like a beam that chases darkness away. So Santos points out that the post-abyssal artist, with her beam of creativity, for example, interrupts modern division that views metropolitan sociability as light and colonial sociability as darkness. And in the next thesis, Santos points out that the post-abyssal artist specializes in struggle, experience, and corporeality. Now, in that regard, he argues that the post-abyssal artist specializes in the struggles of liberation and emancipation, in the experience of abyssal exclusion. This is like exclusion that is more pronounced, and the corporeality of the enslaved, racialized, and sexualized bodies. He therefore says that this post-abyssal artist contributes to the struggle against three forms of modern domination that we highlighted in thesis number 1. And these are capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. Now, in this thesis, he calls patriarchy heteropatriarchy, but he's talking about the same patriarchy. So in thesis number 20, Santos points out that the post-abyssal artist walks on the abyssal line. I think we've talked this, we've referred to this before. And when he was walking on the abyssal line, the line that divides, that separates metropolitan sociability from colonial sociability, he disrupts the status quo. And once that is disrupted, it's a move towards liberation or the end of discrimination and other forms of vices. And in the thesis number 21, Santos points out that the post-abyssal artist translates the abyssal exclusions. These are exclusions that are more pronounced, that characterize colonial sociability into aesthetic motives that are monstrous and intelligible at the same time. And he also argues that the monstrosity of the artists consists in showing the ontological degradation and the fabricated absence of which colonial sociability is made. So in other words, in this particular thesis, the point is that, and he knows that the post-abyssal artist can translate ruins into moments of hope, especially for the people of the Greater South. And in thesis 22, which is the last one, Santos points out that the post-abyssal artist is an active promoter of new possibilities. So even though we are subjugated, even though we are subjected to these three forms of domination, he is an active promoter of new possibilities. So in that regard, Santos points out that the post-abyssal artist turns ruins into seeds, invents new territories as liberated zones, and old territories as counter-hegemonic time spaces. So this artist has got a vision, and his or her vision is that of a society that is free of oppression, free of any forms of domination, and where there is no discrimination. Therefore, the great vocation of the post-abyssal artist is to create art which cannot be ignored in any way, and which urges us to fight for freedom from oppression in our daily lives. So these are the 22 theses that Santos put forward. And from these theses, we can see, well, personally, I see a lot of content that relates to what we do at the OSC. I know we have our experts from the departments, from the program departments, but as a layman, I think I see a lot of links between what he proposes and what we do here at the OSC in the context of the common program for 2025 to 2026. So, just as a reflection, you can go to the next slide, please. Just as a reflection, it's just my own reflection, but I stand to be corrected. I would do this before I conclude. Well, at the OSC here, we're talking about helping countries of the Greater South construct a third, equitable, and inclusive way of development. Well, I don't know if that is a reflection of the alternative way of thinking about the alternatives that Santos presents in his thesis. He's talking about challenging the hegemonic epistemologies of the North that impact the nature, the geopolitics, and economics of knowledge. Is our work at the OSC a reflection of this struggle against the hegemonic epistemologies of the North? Do we have any programs at the OSC that can challenge effectively the hegemonic epistemologies of the North? Well, we're talking about building knowledge-powered societies, I think in stanza 1 of our common program. Is this a reflection or is this a movement towards making countries of the Greater South self-sufficient in terms of knowledge production? Do we subscribe to the notion of having these post-abyssal artists, including the attendant artistic practices? Do we believe in the art of liberation? Is the OSC's revitalization of the cultural and artistic yields a contribution to the creation of the post-abyssal artists in the Greater South? I don't have the answers, but what I would like to do is to quickly conclude. So, well, in conclusion, I think that Santos, in his 22 thesis, presents an opportunity for us in Greater South to critique our ways, to critique our practices in the context of these dominant paradigms that continue affecting us negatively. And these are capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy, and their interconnected systems of oppression. He also points out, and I think he's right, that the resistance to structures that has been, the resistance to these three forms of domination has been fragmented, while domination is continuously working in coordinated totality. So we need to put ourselves together, coordinate, and resist as a front. So, but again, this fragmentation of our resistance has often replicated the very hierarchies it seeks to dismantle. So the Northern epistemologists in that regard sustain these systems by marginalizing alternative knowledges, especially those knowledges that are born in the struggle from the Greater South. Santos also observes that the abyssal line which divides humanity into the zones of being and the zones of non-being has to be tackled or taken seriously. Therefore, he argues that the Southern epistemologies expose and dismantle this divide for the emancipation of the peoples and the citizens of the countries and territories of the Greater South. Santos also observed that the relevance of the post-abyssal artist through the creation of artistic forms that are sites of liberation is something that has, again, to be taken seriously. So in that regard, he points out that the post-abyssal artist disrupts the aesthetics of the North, which are hegemonic, by focusing on resistance, creative creation, and the lived experiences of the oppressed peoples. So, I'm a Seginalo.
I would like to first appreciate the OSC for giving us this opportunity to have this book talk series, which really are helping us to reflect and think about our programs whenever we engage in these presentations and discussions. And it is an honor to be a discussant today. Thank you, Mwamandi. You've presented well the thesis, and my role here is not to regurgitate the thesis, but to provide an analytical framework, inspect these theses along the lines of understanding the fragmented resistance, the struggles, how they've evolved over 5 centuries of colonialism in Latin America, since the 1500s in Asia being colonized, and in the 1800s when Africa is being colonized by the Europeans. And across the board, it is the Europeans. The Eurocentric civilizational paradigm dates back to those 5 centuries in Latin America. So my presentation is structured in 3 parts. My discussion. 1, I'll give general comments about the historical context towards the aesthetics of the epistemologies of the South. I'll also raise standpoints, but I raise them in a way that I refer to scholars who have also engaged in decolonial praxis, who have also engaged along with the Santos in studying epistemic colonialism and also engaging decolonial practice, because this kind of domination of colonialism, of capitalism, and patriarchy has been studied by other scholars. But I will use those scholars not to move away from the thesis, but also help us to understand them better. I'll also conclude in the 3rd part by highlighting key takeaways in relation to the OSC work, especially the common program. So let me start with the historical context to the epistemologies of the Global South and how we find that ourselves in the knowledge struggles. So if I might say, this historical context is not just to talk about the past, but also to highlight how that past informs the present. So colonialism in the global south spans approximately today 533 years if you look at 1492, when Christopher Columbus is discovering a new world order in the Americas. Later on, Asia is colonized in the 1500s, and 300 years later, Africa in the 1800s is colonized. So my discussion also takes into account those timelines, because you have different schools of thought in post-colonial studies and the colonial studies who are studying these events from different contexts in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia. So their submissions, their arguments are diverse based on that historical context. In my general comments, I would say, and I agree with Mwamandi when he presents, that the author talks about how colonialism evolves and its nature. But I would observe that colonialism is in three dimensions. One, territorial colonialism, which ended up balkanizing states, for instance, in Africa. And I would also agree with the author that colonialism didn't end with independence, because, for instance, in Africa, we have settler colonies in South Africa, in Kenya, in Zimbabwe, in Namibia, and some studies suggest Uganda, though it is debatable. So, colonialism is territorial, the boundaries that were demarcated, and later on I can argue that continents like Africa still struggle to unite because of that balkanization, because of that intervention by the colonialists. Then colonialism is about mental colonialism. Mwamandi, you mentioned deep. And also, I'll also raise that point using one of the authors on decolonizing the mind. And also, I would like to argue that colonialism was structural and systemic. Systemic in a sense that one of the forms of domination, capitalism, is structural in nature. And that's why we find that our structures of economies in agriculture, industry, and services, we struggle to experience structural transformation. In advanced economies, they've transformed from agriculture, from agrarian economies, and they've transformed into industrialization, then to the service industry. The education systems are advanced, but ours are still struggling. So maybe to mention that one of the works that can help us understand settler colonialism is an anthropologist, Patrick Wolfe, whose work is titled Settler Colonization, Settler Colonialism, and the Elimination of the Native. That is some work that we can refer to later. In the second part of my discussion, after the historical part, the historical context, I will now turn to invoking the voices of different scholars on these particular forms of domination, but also in different contexts that I've mentioned earlier. And I would like to have made this choice to stand on the shoulders of these intellectual giants. And I would draw from Isaac Newton's intellectual humility, who in 1675 is saying that if I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. So this is why I bring in the these different scholars who are engaging post-colonial studies and colonial studies, and I will use them to address a cross-cutting theme in these 22 theses, which is the fragmentation of resistance in the struggles to break free from the three forms of domination. So if I can start with colonialism, like I had earlier mentioned, the balkanization of states in continents like Africa has made it hard to govern these states and to mobilize against the challenges that face these states. And therefore, we have different traps that trap us as a result of colonization, because you find that there are places on the continent which are referred to Anglophone, some are referred to Francophone, and some are referred to Russophone, depending on who colonized which part of the continent. And this has implications for the artistic expressions that the author mentions in the thesis, and the ways of knowing, and by extension, engaging in alternative thinking of the alternatives. In my discussion, I don't want to look at the artist like he presents the artist, but also refer to the arts and humanities, which is the home of the artists that he talks about. And you realize that the epistemic colonization is experienced in how we handle these disciplines in our universities, especially in the global south. So I would say that in the Latin American context, where we see colonialism for the past 5 centuries, one of the authors is Walter Minoro, who talks about coloniality, who argues that indeed colonialism is still with us. And he categorizes the coloniality of power, the coloniality of knowledge, and the coloniality of being, and calls for a decolonial option from this state of affairs in Latin America. And by extension, that provides a theoretical framework which informs other scholars who study also Africa, but also Asia. In Asia, Spivak, an Indian scholar, also argues that the subaltern cannot speak. The marginalized, the local groups cannot speak, and yet the European intellectuals assume that they know the other and can write about it in the context of the narrative of the oppressed. Then again, we have a Palestine American intellectual, Edward Said, in his book in 1978, a book titled Orientalism, and mentions how colonialism shaped cultural and economic hierarchies that persist today, uses Orientalism as a critical concept to describe the Western world's depiction and portrayal of the Eastern world, that is the Orient. Societies and peoples of the Orient are those who inhabit regions of Asia and North Africa. So going to the African context and also invoking intellectuals who have studied this form of domination of colonialism, I would like to refer to the work of Ngugi wa Thiong'o in his book, Decolonizing the Mind in 1986, which is a seminal work in postcolonial studies, which calls for the decolonization of the African mind through linguistic and cultural liberation from the colonial legacies. Of course, within Africa, which is, I think, in less than in about 200 years, perhaps, because now Latin America, we're saying 5 centuries, but in Africa now it is in hundreds. So for the purpose of this discussion, Wa Thiong'o invites us to challenge the linguistic traps that we find ourselves in as a result of colonialism, but also the conceptual vocabularies that we are trapped in as we develop conceptual frameworks. in our interventions, wherever we are, whether in the academy or in this space as an international organization, because he says that these linguistic traps continue to center Eurocentric epistemologies, the Eurocentric civilizational paradigm. Then again, in the African context, Untoji, a philosopher from Benin, deploys the concept of scientific extraversion, and he claims that the intellectual and scientific dependency of African intellectuals mirrors broader economic and colonial structures, perpetuating a cycle where African scholarship is oriented towards the Western ways of knowing rather than to the local needs. But when one reflects on what Ngugi wa Thiong'o is proposing about decolonizing the mind, another scholar, an African scholar, asks rhetorically that instead of decolonizing the African mind, should we engage and focus and call for the decolonization of the European mind? How do you rebel against something misrepresenting you when you know that your rebellion is intelligible to you and to others, because you and those others both know that your rebellion can only be articulated and rendered intelligible within the framework laid down by the conceptual language which misrepresents and oppresses you? I was quoting directly. So that's how scholars within these different contexts handle colonialism as a form of domination in which cuts across in these theses. So looking at capitalism as the second form of domination, I would like to point out that the author falls short in articulating how capitalism affects the global South and the epistemologies of the South. Because as we well know that capitalism is linked to colonialism. Colonialism is a structural component in the rise of capitalism. It still enables wealth extraction. The raw materials that were being taken out of these continents are still being extracted. If coffee was being taken in form of raw beans, I don't think anything has changed. And also the global trade hierarchies and labor exploitation that continue to shape economic inequalities, the structural and systemic domination that I referred to earlier of colonialism still determines how capitalism has fragmented the global economy. And therefore it also explains that fragmented resistance that is existence in the three forms of domination. I would like to refer to two scholars before I move to patriarchy as another form of domination. Walter Rodney in 1972 wrote a book on how Europe underdeveloped Africa, and he shows how the pre-colonial period, how Africa fared before the European colonization, and argues that colonialism systematically underdeveloped Africa for Europe's benefit. And of course, capitalism was at the center of Europe underdeveloping Africa. So capitalism and colonialism were used hand in hand to underdevelop Africa. And also I would like to refer to a book written in 2012, whose title is Capitalism, a Structural Genocide by Gary Rich. It addresses the nature of contemporary capitalism and how it generates inequality and structural violence. He argues that global capitalism constitutes a form of genocide against the poor, particularly in the global South. Then I will move on to patriarchy as a system also of dominance, and more particularly as a system of male dominance. And I also observe that in the thesis, the author doesn't explain to us how patriarchy is a form of domination, much as Mwamandi, you talked about heteropatriarchy that he mentions. But I'll also invoke an author, Seshadli, who writes in 2011 and invites us to challenge patriarchy through dance, if dance is an art. Artistic impressions such as dance are still male-dominated and therefore perpetuate domination in multiple contexts, perhaps in Latin America, perhaps in Africa, perhaps in Asia, like the author argues. The author is arguing in the Asian context. As I conclude, the question is, what are the key takeaways for the OSC's work, especially the common program? I would like to say that this chapter speaks in many ways to how the OSC can continuously seek alternative thinking of the alternatives towards a third way of development. It challenges us to continuously rethink our ideological, technical, conceptual frameworks and the theories of change that inform the interventions, which interventions also impact on the results and outcomes of our common programs. Perhaps in the future, there is need to set up a South Commission on the creative economies, because that's where the artists are involved in that creative economy. Because I remember when we had the Festival of the South, we were interviewing artists and we are bringing out these themes to understand what are the challenges that they face in their different contexts. Perhaps they are facing issues of copyright laws. There is an economy around them that is not favorable, that is unequal. So we don't look at the artist as REEF and as a think tank. We are engaging these artists in form of consultations. We don't look at them only as artists involved in artistic expressions, but also as knowledge producers, because at the end of the day, if we are going to have a publication out of these consultations, it is a knowledge production process. So essentially, we are involved in the knowledge struggle, to produce knowledge that is relevant for these artists. Of course, in establishing this commission on creative economies is to borrow from perhaps the UNESCO's creative economy reports, which are published annually. And in some intellectual platforms, of course, have identified some gaps that need to be addressed. And of course, we acknowledge that institutions like UNESCO have contributed important work, especially on the general history of Africa, a project that was started in 1964, which is in 8 volumes. But perhaps this is the time for the OSC to also facilitate the rewriting of the history of the Greater South as part of the contribution to knowledge is born in the struggle. I would use a quote from one of Africa's literary giants, Chinua Achebe, who said, I quote, "Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." Lastly, I would conclude by saying that the OSC can facilitate the process of articulating endogenous development goals, not only for the Greater South, but the entire humanity, which is of course embedded in the vision of a third way of development, based on some of the programs, especially the Congress consultations. And therefore, to disentangle from the 3 forms of domination is not only to seek alternative ways of thinking, but we must mobilize for the structural transformation, which is brought about by the forms of domination through engaging the epistemic diversities of knowledge within the global south, through cultivating multiple knowledge endogenities in the south, rooted in the principle of borrowing from northern epistemologies. I would like to argue that we shouldn't discard northern epistemologies, but we can build on what is positive about them without compromising the wealth of endogenous knowledges of the Greater South. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for this great presentation. I could call this the book talk of the year. It was really, really great and amazing. And one of the things I would like to comment on is the last point of Dr. Simon that say that the story is of the hunter. How do you say it? You say something about the hunter and the story.
The hunter always tells the story if the hunted cannot tell their own, cannot have their own history.
And I think this is a great thing because in the context of the human history, there was 3 revolutions that happened in the 18th, 19th century. The US Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Revolution in Haiti. And if you see how they literally omit, there was an omission of the Haitian Revolution because I think the hunter get all the historian and they rephrase the history according to their own narrative. And if you see the revolution in Haiti, it was more democratic and even more radical than the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Because if you look at the American Revolution, they keep slavery. But in Haiti, after the revolution, they abolished slavery. And it was also more democratic and equal. But it was an epistemicide, or in the sense of Professor Boaventura say it, they omit the Haitian Revolution. It's like it never happened. But they put emphasis on the French Revolution and American Revolution. Sorry, Dr. Isabel, if I say that. But they omit Haiti, as part of one of the major revolutions in the history that shaped democracy. And I think that was and as you say, there should be no social justice without cognitive justice. And what they do to Haiti was like some kind of cognitive injustice. And worse, they say that after the Haiti revolution, we have to pay the independence debt. So they oblige Haiti to pay something that can be equivalent to 100 million francs. That can be equivalent now to more than $100 billion if you take into account the investment that Haiti could have done. And then that was a cognitive, not only a cognitive injustice, it was really something that really prevent the country from growing as a country. And I would say that how do you make restitution for those kind of injustice? That's more than cognitive injustice. And I think that probably we should facilitate the process so that we can have restitution for those things in the past that has been done wrong, for all the epistemicide that occur. We need some reparation and restitution. And I think you talk about sometimes emotional diplomacy. I'm wondering if France gets some guilt for what they have done, if they are willing to give some money back to Haiti. I cannot say that they steal us because I am at OSC in a diplomatic setting. I cannot use the word stealing, but they take something from us, from Haiti. And if they can give back, now we are in 21st century, it could be time to repair this kind of not only cognitive injustice, but to do restitution so that we can really repair those wrongdoing. And my last point will be about what about the epistemicide that are occurring in the Greater South now, and those epistemicide, they are produced by a domination system inside the Greater South that produce those kind of epistemicide. What kind about the domination by our own brothers and sisters inside the Greater South that are still make exclusion? The power dynamic that we produce those exclusion and social discrimination inside of our countries in the Greater South. How do you take that into account? Sorry for embarrassing you for those questions. You don't have to answer. You don't have to answer. It's just a comment. Thank you. Thank you.
Dr. Adrian, can you give examples in that last question? Do you have examples in that last question?
So example is like inside the Greater South, you have power dynamic. For example, I take language inside the Greater South. For example, in a country, you can have 200 languages, but there's some language that will disappear, some that will survive. So this is some kind of epistemicide that will produce some power dynamic inside the Greater South. And Dr. Isabel has done a lot of research on that. I remember your first on some things that will disappear because of those power dynamic inside the. I think that probably Dr. Isabel can add more on that. But it's a real challenge. You know, you don't have to answer it. I don't want to embarrass you with those questions, but it's a real challenge. We have power dynamic inside our own Greater South, you know, that produce social exclusion, discrimination, epistemicide, you know? And then I don't know how, even myself, I don't have the answer. It's just something I just surfaced in the air. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mwamandi and Simon, for the wonderful presentation. And I really like the book because it 100% aligns with the rational and philosophical foundation of what we're doing here at the OSC. You know, all our programs actually rooted on this epistemic plurality, or recognizing multiple ways of knowing the world, including the indigenous. But that doesn't mean, as Simon at the end mentioned, that we're not excluding scientific or methodology or epistemology from the Western world. But while embracing that, we should also be concerned about our indigenous knowledge, our local knowledge, or contextual situation and so on. So it fits so well with what we do and with our programs. Just a small question I want to raise here. I don't know if it has been mentioned in the book. Is there any practical recommendation given as to how we could decolonize, our knowledge system, our knowledge structures in our institutions, in our education systems, like higher education, schools, research institutions, and so on? Because we still are dominated by the Western epistemology and methodology and so on. We still are marginalizing our indigenous and local knowledge from our, universities, from our even development discourses. That's completely marginalized. That means we are not giving a holistic solution to the challenges and problems we're facing in the Greater South, because we need to have our own deep-rooted knowledge in order to address our problems, apart from or in addition to the scientific knowledge that we can gain. So is there anything that Santos mentioned about, as to how to, practically implement this epistemic plurality or diverse ways of knowing the world to address our problems? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for the questions. I think, yes, I start with the question that Dr. Adrian asked. Yes, we have discrimination in the Greater South. We have signs of oppression in the Greater South. But Santos, in his 22 theses, simply gives us an idea that we have the northern epistemologies that he deems hegemonic and oppressive, and then the southern epistemologies that he thinks can help us get liberated from the pangs of oppression or discrimination. But again, he mentioned the three forms of domination that the peoples and the citizens of the Greater South have been subjected to: colonialism, capitalism, and patriarchy. Now, in his thesis, he does not explicitly acknowledge that we in the Greater South are also subjected to those forces of domination coming from the Greater South. But I know that we have so many cases of oppression, discrimination within the bloc that we call the Greater South. Now, it is up to us to work in coordinated totality to end these vices, such as, discrimination, oppression, and you mentioned epistemicide. It is up to us to work and collaborate and come up with strategies that can help us move out of that situation. Well, Prof says, are there any practical recommendations for decolonizing knowledge systems and structures? Well, Santos, in his 22 thesis, does not explicitly give those recommendations as to how we can decolonize the knowledge systems and structures. But I think his theses are a point of departure to allow us understand that the end of territorial domination or colonization is not the end of everything. We still have other forms of colonization that are continuously affecting us as the Greater South. And as such, we need to have these alternative way of thinking about the alternatives for us to completely get decolonized in terms of the education systems, as you put, in terms of having structures that do not replicate the hegemonic domination that are created by the hegemonic northern epistemologies. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Adrian, I think what you are trying to refer to is not epistemicides, maybe linguicides, because you're talking about oppression of languages, but not epistemic colonization of knowledge. So these linguicides, or even by extension, you've had culturicides where cultures are eroded. So perhaps it is to investigate the specific factors that cause those linguicides in different contexts. I don't want us to risk with generalizing. There are factors which are external and factors which are internal. Because the colonial tendencies were not only from outside. You well know that colonialists had local agents. They used kingdoms, agents to rule over their societies. So there is that history, and perhaps that could be a discussion that we could extend and not elaborate here because of purposes of time. Then on the question of Prof about how practically the book really addresses some of the issues we are facing, I also am of the view that it doesn't directly talk about it, but in my conclusion, I mentioned that this book really informs our ideological framework in an abstract sense. That's how I said it, but maybe if I could be particular. When you are reading this book, it's not like it is going to perhaps inform BIE, But again, it informs the ideological framework within which you are approaching DIE and its pillars and how they are implemented within the different contexts. So the way we read it will be different, but for me, I think it informs our ideological thinking as an organization. And perhaps it can also inform stanza 1, building knowledge-powered societies, how to position ourselves in this knowledge struggle. That's what I can say.
Coming back to the same question, yeah, it's true that about Boaventura de Sousa, the critics, they said like his limitation or weaknesses is mostly, he works mostly, is more talking about Europe like as a center that we have to decentralize, you know, but he doesn't give, of course, solutions. So if we're talking about epistemology and we think this can have an impact in our development, in our way of thinking, coming back again to the same questions, for example, about contemporary questions we are going through, how can we use this type of like knowledge from the global south, the greater south? So I think it remains as a question. And the second, we have this book was edited by two people, Boaventura de Sousa, who is from Portugal, and then Maria Paula Meneses, of course, teaching in Portugal, but she's from Mozambique, as you mentioned. So we have, when we are talking about epistemology from the greater south, of course, we think about Africa, we think about Asia, and Latin America. So mostly thinking about Latin America and Africa. And it's like we have everything in common. That's the way we think. We're talking about the greater south, or epistemology of the greater south. But you have a lot of differences going on, even our thinking. So my question would be, what do we have really, if we're talking about epistemology of the greater south, I would just take two examples, for example, from Africa and Latin America. What do we have in common we think we can build on? And what kind of limitations or weaknesses we have in the two different schools of thought? Because we have also a lot of differences. You know, if we are talking about the coloniality, post-colonial studies, whatever, there are a lot of differences, you know. Can you talk about that? What do we have in common you think we can build on, and some differences we have also to fix, because of course it's epistemologies of the greater south. So that the two questions, but about contemporary issues, what kind of solution, I mean not solution, what do they suggest? So because just saying like we have been colonized, we are oppressed, we are this, having like, that is okay, we know, but what do we suggest? And the second about the two schools of thought.
Thank you for the the very insightful, enlightening book talk. I really enjoyed learning about this author, his work, and also your very well contextualized kind of framing of the work in the context of other thinkers who are also, you know, working to decolonize scholarship and to present some of these alternatives to the alternatives of thinking. And so I think the thing that I'm sitting with as I reflect on this talk is this the kind of binary that Boaventura sets up, which in some cases I think helps us understand very complex things in a more simple way. You know, the metropolitan versus the colonial, you know, the human versus the subhuman. But I wonder if you could reflect for me a little bit more on, especially this binary between the human and the subhuman, which, you know, I'm thinking also about Edward Said's Orientalism, right? And this idea of how Europe, especially, or the North, let's say global North, perceives other parts of the world and the ways in which it becomes very caricatured and simplified and flattened and stereotyped. And I'm thinking about, you know, this idea of the subhuman. If you are saying that there's a perspective on people as subhuman, That's one thing to say, because people have been colonized, or because also maybe they're under patriarchy or capitalism, that they are the subjugated, that they therefore are that they are seen as some human. But what do you think about the idea that they actually are in a state of being subhuman? And I think I really like this comment that you brought, Simon, about, and the quote, and I would love to know whose quote it was, about maybe we need to think about decolonizing the European mind, because it makes me question the definition of human. What kind of definition of human are we utilizing to call people who have been subjugated subhuman? That they are in a state of being subhuman. And I wonder if we need to rethink perhaps the definition, how we understand what humanity is. At least for me, my experience as someone who was raised in the global north, but came to the greater south and made it my home, is that I find humanity everywhere, a sense of humanity, but you can feel the difference in the definitions of humanity when you go in different spaces. And I really appreciate the alternate definition, the alternate understanding of what humanity is when I live in Ethiopia, for example. And I think this is something that's, it's not necessarily to critique the author, but to say for us, to the degree to which we take on his framework as our theoretical framework, are we accepting this, this idea, or are there ways that we can also build upon that to have a more perhaps nuanced view on what subjugation means, and to what degree does that define the subjects of that subjugation? So this, I guess I would be interested in your reflection.
I'll start with the question or the comment that Dr. Isabel has given. Yes, so in the thesis, Santos talks about the state of being and the state of non-being. And he argues that the northern epistemologies have pronounced this division. Again, in the thesis, Santos also talks about, some peoples, especially peoples of the global south, being subjected to these three forms of domination that he highlights, especially in thesis number 1, colonialism, capitalism, and patriarchy. However, and I do agree with you, he does not explicitly define to us what being human means, or what being subhuman means. We need to find something that is pluriversal with regard to these two concepts of being human and being non-human or subhuman. But I understand that his position, when he came up with these words that are contained in his thesis, were based on the fact that historically, some parts of the world, like as Simon said, Latin America, Africa, and Asia have been subjected to territorial colonization. And I think that's the point of departure, to say, okay, we have the people that have been colonized in terms of, or that have been colonized partially. And as such, I think that extends to the treatment that these people in these territorial colonies received from their colonial masters. I'll just give an example of what happened in Malawi. We were under the British for about 70 years, from I think 1894 until 1964. And we've had some settlements by the British, or we had settlements by the British, and the people that were working for these British settlers or colonizers in their farms and in offices were subjected to dehumanizing conditions. Again, it's subjective. But personally, I understand that if you look at the treatment that these people were subjected to, is something that can prompt someone to say they're being treated as subhumans. Again, it's subjective, because what is subhuman to me may not be subhuman to Simon or to Rosalind. So in his work, I do acknowledge that there are a lot of subjectivities that need to be tackled and properly defined if we're to move forward. So as the people of Greater South, I think the vocation is for us to contextualize the thesis, because we cannot just import them wholesale. I think we have to properly contextualize them if we're to come up with actual meanings that can help us move forward as the peoples of the countries and territories of the Greater South. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Jean-Pierre will allow me to answer her first, but that helps me to get to answering your question. Dr. Isabel, you talk about the binary, or if at all it is a dichotomy. But you see, colonialism, like I mentioned, is dimensional. One of the dimensions is mental colonialism, and the colonizer had a frame of mind of how they look at the colonial subject, if I might say that. I want to particularly quote from Rugard, who we know was going around in the colonies, and particularly in places in East Africa. And we have places in Uganda which are named after Lord Rugard. He had this to say, and it is a notable quote by Lord Rugard about Africans, taken from his book, The Dual Mandate, in 1926. He says, I quote, "In character and temperament, the typical African of this race type is a happy, thriftless, excitable person, lacking in self-control, discipline and oversight, naturally courageous and naturally courteous and polite, full of personal vanity, with little sense of veracity, fond of music and loving weapons as an Oriental loves jewelry." You referred to Edward Said. I continue with the quote. "His thoughts are concentrated on the events and feelings of the moment, and he suffers little from apprehension for the future or grief for the past." This is someone, like I said, like I argued, that the subaltern cannot speak from the context of Asia, where Spivak is saying that these European intellectuals, and this was, I think, a politician, he's defining, reporting back to the colonial headquarters of how he perceives an African. And by extension, these are the kind of education systems, these are the kind of social systems that were built into our identities. So much as Boaventura talks about the subhuman, this is the subhuman that was constructed by colonialism. In the Rwandan context, there were these social homes that were created to teach women by the French how a woman should behave. There is a phrase in French for those social homes, but I can share literature about that. So while we can revisit our identities and form identities, but I wanted to say that the colonialists form different ways of knowing about ourselves, because again, from the decolonial and post-colonial school of thought, as I go to Dr. Jean-Pierre's, in the Latin American context, all terminology is talking about the coloniality of being. It is perpetual. The way we see ourselves is from that colonial frame of mind. So to decolonize is not going to be a destination, it will be a constant struggle. to decolonize knowledge, because this is knowledge that is going to be born out of the struggle. But we need to know how, as Latin America, as Africa, as Asia, how should we position ourselves to win in this struggle? Perhaps we'll win battles, but we will not win the war. So that takes me to Dr. Jambe's questions. I remember even the author is framed as a white intellectual studying the epistemologies of the South. And some scholars are accusing him of studying the epistemologies of the global South when he's white. And they accuse him of using frameworks that are even based in the Eurocentric paradigm, like Marxism. He has a Marxist ideological bent that he uses, but he answers these scholars and tells them, look, I'm not talking about a geographical South. I'm talking about an epistemic South. I'm not talking about a racist South, because I think these scholars want to show, to again replay a racist kind of game in accusing him of maybe being a racist, studying the global South. But I think he raises important points which we can learn from, and that's why I said we can also engage Northern epistemologies. On your question on practical interventions, for me, I look at these, the way I look at the schools of thought, is that they help us understand the struggle at hand. The solutions are contextual. Perhaps they inform the decolonial praxis, and praxis comes from theory informing practice. So it also depends on how we deploy the conceptual vocabularies that I talked about, and some conceptual vocabularies will not apply in certain contexts. And as OSC, as we work on our conceptual frameworks, technical framework, whether it is revising the global guide, we need to inspect these concepts and see which concepts are relevant. But now I cannot point to a particular concept, but I believe we'll have that ongoing discussion as we work together. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it will be just a comment for a few things. One is about the subhuman that is used by Boaventura de Sousa. There was also another expression that is by Engelbert Vang, is a Cameroonian philosopher. He was talking about anthropological poverty, thinking about situations of people in Africa, especially who went through colonization, and think about their identity. So, and he was looking at that through the point of view of anthropology. So the second comment I would like to make is about, I mean, the example you gave, like, for example, being in Africa and in Europe, like the positions, like West thing. So, is very interesting, and I will give just example of Maya Angelou, the poet, who was thinking about the situation of African American and the situation in the US systemic injustice, and she said, so this I'm thinking about the colonizer and the other. So, and she was saying, it's so easier for me to be a Black woman. It's easier for me, and she said, because for me, what the world is asking me is to forgive for injustice and to fight for my liberation. That is possible, and I can do that. But it's so difficult to be a white man, because being a white man means you have to renounce to your privileges. So, of course, talking about white men, this is not as a person, but as a posture. Like anyone can be, that's white men, is metaphorically speaking. So, but from there, then the question is not like me and the other. What about, because we're talking about epistemology, what about if the other is also inside me. So what about if the African intellectual, the Latin American intellectual, that's white person, because we're talking about patriarchy, that white person is a posha, metaphorical, is also inside me. So it means like if I want that liberation, somehow I have to accept my own death. Somehow that is intellectual. If I exist as a Jean-Pierre specialist of French literature or whatever, that is defined me as intellectual. So if I want liberation, it means I'm also questioning this kind of knowledge. So that is also a point I would like to mention. And here I'm thinking about also the way that one is talking about the monolinguism of the other. So talking about himself, but so the other can be also inside me. So not just looking about the other. I would like just to stop there. Thanks.